Hey everybody, Quantum here on the Friday before the first weekend of the Store Set Championships. And recently I put up a poll asking if you wanted a deck profile for Emerald Steel or Sapphire Steel, and the Sapphire Steel won out. And so, linked in the description is some gameplay with this updated tech version of Sapphire Steel. This is by no means the definitive way to play the deck, but these are definitely some updated tech options that might be helping you in some matchups where you might be struggling. Again, if you've been a part of the meta for the past 2 weeks, you've seen very rapid developments in people adapting their decks because the meta is changing very, very quickly in order for people to try to get an edge in those store championships. So we're going to go over this deck profile and I'll explain some of the choices, some of the matches that this deck does well into, where you might struggle, and some choices that you may want to consider if you were planning to play Sapphire Steel, in my opinion. Before we get started, though, I just want to give a quick shout out to the 6 members of the YouTube channel. Thank you again for the additional support, and the Patreon members and the PayPal donations that I've received recently. So again, there are links in the description if you do want to provide any kind of additional support on top of just liking and subscribing and commenting, which also help as well. So with that out of the way, let's get into it here. So to start off, you can see already we have now opted to include a Robin Hood package. Whenever you see the small Robin Hood, the 1-drop, we're playing the big 5-drop Robin Hood, the Shift 3. And we've basically replaced the Captain Hook package and Tinkerbells, which I know is a little controversial, and I'll get into why, with this package. And the main reason is kind of the same thing I discussed in my Amber Steel video with Tinkerbell and why it was cut from that list. Is this deck I think can utilize Tinkerbell a little bit better because you can ramp into the Tinkerbell, and it's definitely still a really strong card, and a lot of top players are still playing Tinkerbell, so it's still an option for you. But I just find the versatility of being able to shift 3 and not have to play Mickey Mouse, which I find very underwhelming, the detective that ramps you, because instead of playing Mickey Mouse on turn 3 to get the extra ink, just so that you can get a turn 5 the next, a 5-drop on the next turn, you can shift the Robin Hood on turn 3 and then sing all of your 4 and 5 cost songs like the Let the Storm Rage on. Then Along Came Zeus, Grab Your Swords, Whole New World, Let It Go if you're playing that as well. Now, if you play a 1-drop Robin Hood on turns 1 or 2, it's pretty telegraphed that you're going to probably shift the big Robin Hood, so your opponent will likely try to out it with something like Fire the Cannons, Teeth and Ambitions, exert it down with like a Pinocchio or a last-ditch effort in order to take it out to prevent that shift 3. So just be very aware of that. Also on like turn 3, it could also get Cloud Kickered and whatnot, just to slow down your tempo. So it is a little vulnerable to that if you're going for that kind of play. But again, in that gameplay video, I think I showed you guys what happened when my opponent ended up outing my Robin Hood, and I think they Teeth and Ambition did actually, and I had a Cogsworth and a Fishbone Quill anyway, so it's just like multiple different lines in order for you to kind of get that early 5-drop on board, or get your 5-drop on board early so that you can start facilitating your songs. And against aggro, where they don't really have removal options, this card with the Robin Hood really shuts that down, and I know this deck traditionally has struggled a little bit against aggro. That's why you've seen some people also include things like 3 copies of Fire the Cannons, which is a good tech card, but drawing this in the late game is very underwhelming, especially if you're like in a top deck mode. But we'll go over all of that in just a bit. But yeah, the Robin Hood is, again, you can just see so much application. It's very, very relevant. And when you're thinking about like, well, this replaced the hook, what about the Smee synergy? Captain Hook goes the 3-2. It really, prevents like, let's say, Emerald Amethyst from questing because it so favorably trades into like the Merfolk and the Flynn Rider. But again, so does the 1-drop Robin Hood, right? And then when you shift this, it provides you even more value. Like top decking this in the late game compared to a Captain Hook, they're both not great, but Captain Hook is a little bit better. But I just think the early game that this offers you, and even in the mid game, right, when you can still shift this later on, is just really, really valuable because we've seen how good that Robin Hood is. To round out the 1-drops, I know I spent a lot of time on that Robin Hood, but it's literally that important because I'm explaining why we've opted to change from one to the other, right? Now, this 1-drop package, pretty standard. I know there's been some discussion around, do you include Develop Your Brain or not? I think you absolutely need this card. For the same reason why you include this in Ruby Sapphire, you need scry cards. You need cards to dig into your deck to find what you need, especially when you start ramping. Like the 1 cost here is kind of meaningless, but this is an amazing top deck. This is good in the like early game. It's good after you wheel and you get this if you don't have the card you're looking for. And the main reason why, honestly, like, the big secret as to why you play a lot of these scry cards is because once you get to that mid to end game, what you're really trying to dig for is your lucky dime, right? Your lucky dime is what's going to like close out your game in so many different matchups because unless your opponent's playing steel, the lucky dime is usually not going to be interactable with. Like some Sapphire decks might be playing Judy Hops, but once you drop that lucky dime, like your opponent just knows I want like a 2-turn clock before I lose the game, right? So it puts so much pressure. There's been games where I've been able to literally put 20 lore on board if my opponent doesn't deal with my board because, Tamatoa is going to quest for like 6, get back an item, put it on board, and then lucky dime it for like another 7, that's 15, then quest with, something else for game. Like, and you can come back when you're on the draw with a combo like that to win the game like instantly. So develop your brain, I think, is absolutely mandatory if you play any kind of Sapphire deck right now. I've talked about this at length in my other Sapphire Steel video where I said, I was including small Cogsworth because, big Cogsworth is pretty good, especially into the other steel decks, but it's definitely underwhelming into the Ruby decks. And so in order to give you a little bit more resiliency, I've opted to cut the small Cogsworth. That was just, an experimental tech option. No one else was really running that, but I thought, let me just try it out because, Shift 3 Cogsworth is essentially the same thing as Shift 3 Robin Hood, right? It gets you a 5-cost Singer on board on turn 3 instead of turn 5 or turn 4 if you're ramping with Fishbone Quill. But the 1 jump ahead in the 2-drop slot is also very good because it provides you an alternative turn 2 play to the Smee. Whereas before, if you were just playing the Smee, if you didn't have Smee on turn 2, it's like you're developing a popsicle or something. Like, it's still a little underwhelming. But at least with this on turn 2, if you can ramp with the 1 jump ahead, it's really relevant because this deck probably has the best draw engines in the entire game. And by that, I think it's even better than like Ruby Amethyst with like the Merlin Rabbits, and even better than Amethyst Steel, simply because you have the instant impact of Hierums, right? And so what this allows you to do is if you turn 2 1 jump, let's say you turn 1 popsicle, you turn 2 1 jump, and then turn 3, you can ink something, and then your Hierum comes online, turn 3, pop your popsicle, you have a draw engine online on turn 3, which is absolutely ridiculous. And then, you also play other draw engines in the forms of, well, a whole new world, of course, if you're able to sing it or even hardcast it, but also in the Beast Tragic Hero. So because you have these multiple draw engines, the faster that you can develop one of them, because it's going to get outed, right? Like your Hierum's going to get Medusa, it's going to get, Maui, it's going to get something is going to take it out. And then you just develop the next draw engine, right? You just drop a Beast Tragic Hero. You just whole new world. So you constantly have these draw engines online. And the faster you can do that in the game, the faster you can start dropping your threats, right? Because you're drawing into more cards, so you can deal with your opponent's board. And then the Smee should be a no-brainer, right? It's like literally one of the best 2-drops in the game. The fact that you can play this, any steel deck, I think, opts to play this right now. A 2-cost 3/3 that quests for 2. Absolutely insane. Of course, when you have the Cogsworth on board, you don't take the damage when it's exerted. Yes, you're not playing the Captain Hook for the synergy, but honestly, like, I don't want to have a dead Captain Hook sitting on board while I quest with Smee and Captain Hook just sits there because I can't quest with it because it instantly gets outed. That's why I also prefer the Robin Hood there, because I don't care about taking the damage on this. Like, this card's going to get outed at some point anyways, and either I'm going to challenge with it or my opponent's going to challenge into it, or I just let it burn for the 3 damage before I get a Cogsworth up. But having that Robin Hood there instead to potentially shift and make that 1-drop very useful. So on curve, right, you can see the other combo you can maybe run is like Robin Hood and then Smee on 2 and then turn 3 shift Robin Hood, right? Now you have like 4 lore pressuring, you have a big body in the Robin Hood that's going to be able to deal with the opponent's threats at a 3/6 body. It is super strong there, in my opinion. So that's why we're opting to play this package. The 1 jumps, I think, are very good. And then again, if you draw these in the late game when you have a Fishbone Quill up, you likely just Fishbone it. So it's not really that detrimental, and we're only running 3 copies of it as well. Now in the 3-drop slot, it should be, well, I guess we'll go over this first. Instead of the Mickeys, I'm opting to run the Benjas. And this is another reason why the Robin Hood package works well, because now I don't need to worry about that extra like ramp card that I need to play. If I don't have Fishbone Quill, I need to have a Mickey. If I don't have Fishbone Quill, hopefully I have a Robin Hood shift package in order to get out the Robin Hood on turn 3 and maybe sing a whole new world even earlier than I would if I ramped with the Mickey. And the Benja, just provides so much value. We've already talked about how insane this card is. It's literally one of the best cards in the game, in my opinion. It provides you so much advantage. Taking out a critical item, a Fishbone Quill on the Ruby Sapphire side, a flute on the Amber Steel Song side, a spellbook on the Ruby Amethyst or Steel Amethyst side, and then it's just a body that quests for 2 at a 2/3. It's really, really strong. Yeah, there's nothing to say there. Benja is an absolute beast of a card. And then, of course, you've got the 4 Fishbone Quills. don't need to explain anything here. This is the card you definitely want to try to mulligan for every game to have in your opening hand so that you can just start ramping. And the faster you ramp, the faster your engine comes online. The longer the game goes, well, unless you're against Ruby, but usually the longer the game goes, the better chance you have to close it out and win. As a tech option, we are opting to include 2 bells. You can up this to 3, but this card is basically only played for Lucky Dime. You generally don't want to see this until very late into the game. So again, those scry cards, hopefully don't put this to the bottom of the deck, but you know, picking this up in the mid game and holding it for when you have the dime can literally be a super clutch play. You don't want to play this without usually having the dime on board, especially in those Ruby matchups, or even against the Emerald matchups, because it does get cloud kickered back to your hand, so be aware of that. But in the Ruby matchups, you know, they'll Medusa, they'll Maleficent Dragon, they'll be prepared to clear this off the board because it's such a big threat. If this does end up surviving after you Lucky Dime, you just quest and Lucky Dime again. That's 15 lore across 2 turns. So, you know, if you drop Bell, it's usually going to be pretty much an instant win for you. And then, of course, like I've already mentioned, one of your key draw engines that you can now get online a turn early on turn 3 is the Hero and Flavorsham. You know, pretty staple card in the deck, in any Sapphire deck, to be honest. And now, to round out the 4 slot, we're opting to play 3 copies of And Then Along Came Zeus. This card is just proven to be a little bit more of an effective removal piece. Just the 5 damage that it can deal, also potentially to locations, so like Pride Lands, McDuck Manors, and even Queen's Castles is very relevant. So I think, you know, just playing more copies of this, because you can sing it with the Hiram too if you don't have an item to banish with it, which is pretty good. And then just hard casting it sometimes is also decent enough. And now you get to the real top end of the deck. I think you still want to play 4 Cogsworth, because it is really that important. In the Ruby matchups, I've talked about this before, you might want to play this to be a singer, but usually after that it's just going to be ink, because this card is very susceptible to just being wiped out with Be Prepareds. In matches where this card can't be interacted with, so in like the Emerald matchup, they can't Cloud Kicker this even though it has 2 strength. In other Steel matchups, they literally have no way to deal with this. This card is an absolute beast. It's only in the Ruby matchups where this card is slightly a liability in my opinion, but it's still not bad. It quests for 2 as well, and then when you have double Cogsworth on board, when they each give each other resist and everything else resist 2, it's like ridiculous, especially into non-Ruby matches. So again, knowing when you need to fish for this card and play it and hold it versus when to ink it is very important. And then the 5 cost shift Robin Hood, for all the reasons I already explained. With the 1-drop Robin Hood, you need to play 4. An amazing card overall. And then I opted to test without this card, but I opted to put it back in place of the Tinkerbells because, like I was describing in the Amber Steel video, the Tinkerbell just seems a little slow. It comes down, yes, it deals 1 damage to everything, but then you have to wait a turn because you're not shifting it. And your opponent will likely just be like, okay, now I have to play it on the Tinkerbell, which I can do, remove it, or, you know, just whatever, play around it. Whereas when the Beast Tragic Hero comes down, yes, it's not pressuring your opponent right away for removal, but the card draw that this offers you is going to be very beneficial, especially if your Hiram engine gets outed, if you don't have a whole new world. You know, you're down to like a couple of cards because you've been aggressively inking with the Fishbone Quill. This is the card that helps you refill your hand. If your opponent opts to try to damage it, they're wasting tempo, they're wasting their turn to, you know, prevent you from drawing the extra card, and you don't really care about that because, again, you probably will end up having another form of a draw engine in the the Hero and Flavorsham or the Whole New World. And again, the Tinkerbell for me, like against aggro, I just think, you know, maybe this does the job pretty much. Do I really need this as well? It is slow. It feels a little clunky. I'd rather just play more 5-drops that I can potentially get out on turn 4 because of the 1 jump ahead or the Fishbone Quill. And so this package of 5-drops allows you to do that. So that's why I built out the curve this way. For the songs, we've opted for 2, 2, and 4. Of course, I tested 3 Whole New Worlds, but I think, you know, when you're playing the Robin Hood package, you can definitely afford to play the 4th Whole New World. And again, if you draw multiples, you'll just ink it. And then, you know, you're not totally reliant on this card. I mean, it is a very important part of your engine. But if you don't see this, like I said, you have Beast Tragic Hero to draw, you have Hiram to draw. So it's not always the end of the world. You just have to make sure you plan accordingly. Like if you use this and you don't wheel into another one, you have to maybe change up your game plan. Do I value the Huron either on board or in my hand now? Do I value the Beast Tragic Hero a little bit more? Do I have to play to protect that? I can't be as aggressive in quest with it, that kind of thing. Do I have to maybe play around my opponent's board to make sure my Huron survives because I don't have that other whole new world? But again, you play scry cards, so maybe you can scry for another one. But you try to generally want to play as safe as possible to always ensure that you have a way to keep your hand healthy. You want to avoid being in top deck mode with this deck. But again, top decking a card like this could literally be the factor in you winning or losing a game, to be honest. But again, the scry cards will help with that. Now, the Grab Your Swords, I talked about this in the Amber Steel Song video as well. 3 copies in this deck could also work. The only thing that feels really bad with this is if you draw 2 in your opening hand. Because A, it's a dead card in the beginning, most likely. You'll be inking it with Fishbone Quill at your earliest opportunity if you can. And it likely will just get ripped out of your hand with the Ursula Deceiver if you're up against Emerald as well, right? So these are all factors to consider. Again, if a whole new world gets ripped with the Ursula, you probably don't care too much because you have these alternative forms of draw engine, especially with Emerald not having a way to damage the beast. But it's something to consider. The Grab Your Swords can definitely come in clutch in certain situations, just providing that extra little bit of damage that you need in order to take out an opponent's board or some important threats. And then the reason we're still playing Let It Goes is because in the late game, you want to have just spot removal. You don't want to play this early. You don't want to ramp your opponent. But when you're, say if you're in the Ruby Sapphire matchup, they drop a Tamatoa and they're on like 13 ink, you're on 14 ink. Like, it doesn't matter at that point if you let it go. Like, you have to let it go to Tamatoa, right? Whereas, what other options do you have to deal with the Tamatoa? Almost nothing else, right? So, in those matchups where it's difficult, you're basically in a race, and just anything you can do to slow down your opponent, like let it going their Tamatoa, is going to be super critical. And that could literally be the difference between you winning and losing a match. This is also kind of utilized for the Cinderella in the Amber Steel Song matchup. One of the ways that Amber Steel Song can beat this deck is if they go very aggressive with flutes and do the shift Cinderella, because you sometimes don't have a way to really out that. You have to throw multiple things into the Cinderella and or use Zeus's on it. But if you can just let it go, even though it might give them like 2 ink because of the 1-drop Cinderella, the Amber one being shifted on top of with the Steel Cinderella, like that's just something you have to take to out a big threat. And you shouldn't care too much because you've been gaining a lot of advantage with your ramp and your extra draws. So keep that in mind. Now, speaking of scrying, we're opting to continue to play the Gaston. There is a case to be made that you can replace this with the 4-drop inkable Grammatala. That's a 3/3. It only quests for 1 and it only scries for 2, but it is an inkable resource. Gaston digs 1 extra deep. It does quest for 3 if it survives, and it is a good lucky dime target. But that being said, it is uninkable. Drawing this in your opening hand does feel very, very bad sometimes, especially if you get multiple in the early game, because the way that this works is, just like with Ruby Amethyst, if you draw these high-end cards early on, it means you're not drawing them later on when you actually need to see them. And so you're inking them early, and then, towards the end game, you don't have the big threats left in order to close the game out with. So this card functions more than just, a scry and a body. It's an end game closer for you in combination with the next card, which is going to be Lucky Dime. This is basically, I don't want to say what the deck is made around now, but in those very tough Ruby matchups, which is really the only thing you have to really worry about mostly with this deck. I mean, sometimes aggro can give it a little bit of an issue, but with the Ruby matchups, when they start getting to the point where they drop Medusas and Tremaines, Be Prepared, Maleficent Dragons, Maui's, that kind of thing to always out your board, you need a way to instantly gain lore. And so dropping that bell with this already on field and then gaining that 5 lore instantly, now you don't care if it gets Medusa or whatever because you got your 5 lore. Then you drop your Gaston, you scry, you set up the next play to Lucky Dime, and then you Lucky Dime the Gaston for 3. So even though you're not going to be able to quest too often, the Lucky Dime is progressing your lore progression towards the win, basically, when you're in that kind of situation. So very important card to, again, scry for when you need it into the late game. And then to close things out, we've got the Tamatoas here. I'm opting for 2 copies in my build. You can definitely go higher on this. I know that Ruby Sapphire plays 4, but the main reason why you want to play this is not only because you can kind of pull off the same combo as Ruby Sapphire, where you're able to recur a Popsicle and then quest with or play a Huron and just kind of cycle that draw engine over and over again. But this is just a big body that's hard to out. In the Ruby Sapphire match, yes, it gets Maleficent Dragon, it could get Tremaine. Actually, in the Ruby Amethyst matchup, mine did get Tremaine when I had the win on board, as somebody pointed out, and I didn't do it. But you could opt to go a little bit heavier on the Tamatoas if you want. But for me, 2 seems okay. because you don't really find yourself like that stacked on items. For some reason, Ruby Sapphire always is more stacked on items, but you don't really find yourself in that situation that often. But again, this is a good option if you have 2 or 3 items on board. It just makes your lucky dime that much more like valuable. Now, to be fair, like while the bell is also a good option, so you can maybe think like, why don't I just play 4 bell? That you could do that, or play 4 Tamatoa if you really want to focus on an item heavy build. But you've seen Ruby Sapphire tech in 1 or 2 copies of Bell now as well, whereas before they were really just looking at Lucky Diming their Tamatoas for huge value, whereas the Ruby Steel decks looked at Lucky Diming the Bell for their value. So again, you can play around with the ratios and see what you like. Early game, this is ink, but drawing this in the late game can be very good, especially against opposing Steel decks. But you can consider this maybe like a win more card, but just the fact that it also recurs your items is very, very good. So it also has multiple utility there in addition to just being a big body. So that is the deck and the reasons why, and some of the matchup rationale why we've made some of those changes. Additional tech options, like I've mentioned, you can opt to play the Tinkerbell if you want. You can opt to play more Tamatoa. Fire the Cannons if you have an aggro heavy meta. 4th copy of Beast Tragic Hero if you just really want to value that draw. A 3rd copy of Grab Your Swords if you think you need more aggro threats. And if you're in a location heavy meta, maybe you have like a lot of Pride lands and or McDuck Manors and or Queen's Castle players fishing around, you can also opt to tech in copies of Rise of the Titans. Overall though, I think this deck is fairly resilient. It's not really explosive like Ruby decks can be. It's very slow to develop. Not slow to develop. It can be fast to develop because of the Fishbone Quill, but what I will say is like you do need to see that curve in order for things to work out. And you know, to be fair with the scry cards, like this deck should be more consistent than Ruby Sapphire, right? Because you play all of the same consistency cards, you just have additional draw engines in the Whole New World and Beast Tragic Hero. But that's why Ruby Sapphire is so good into the meta, right? Is because, well, yes, they technically should lose to aggro, but if they go up against Steel, you Whole New World them into a tremendous advantage. So in that matchup, you want to try to avoid playing a Whole New World as best you can. Ink it with your Fishbone Quill. Use your alternative draw engines, mainly your Hiram engine, because your Beast Tragic Hero is susceptible to getting Medusa'd and just getting outed. But the Hiram draw engine will put in work for you just like it puts in work for them. And in certain situations, if they build up their hand with their own hero, then you can opt a Whole New World. There's a lot of nuances to that matchup in order to try to overcome it, but it definitely will be your toughest matchup in the day if you do play this deck into the store set championships. Anyways, we're getting on to 22 minutes here, so we're going to wrap up this video. If you did find it helpful, let me know in the comment section below. And yeah, best of luck to everybody who's participating. I don't know if I'll be able to go next week. I won't be able to go to one this weekend, unfortunately, just too busy. But, you know, I'm interested to hear results, what you played, how you did, what you thought of it. And, yeah, let me know. Anyways, that's going to wrap it up for the video, guys. Thank you again for watching. If you made it this far, Quantum is out.